Hello and welcome to Mr.Gamereview show. Don't forget to subscribe the channel, hit the like button and put a comment below the video. Thank you so much. The SNES version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, released in 1993, is a cinematic platformer based on the 1990 film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It attempts to capture the dark and gothic atmosphere of the movie, but struggles in several areas, making it a mixed experience overall. The visuals are one of the game's stronger aspects. The sprite work is fairly detailed, and environments like the eerie castle interiors and foggy landscapes effectively evoke a dark and unsettling atmosphere. However, the game's color palette can sometimes feel too drab, making certain levels blend together. The character animations, especially of Dracula's transformations, are also reasonably well done for the time. Unfortunately, gameplay is where Bram Stoker's Dracula falters. The game is primarily a side-scrolling platformer with combat elements, where you control Jonathan Harker as he fights his way through hordes of enemies including wolves, bats, and other creatures of the night. The combat mechanics are clunky, with stiff controls that make attacks feel imprecise, especially when trying to land hits on smaller enemies or dodging incoming attacks. The level design is somewhat repetitive, and the game has a frustrating difficulty curve, often relying on unfair enemy placement or awkward jumps to create challenge. Boss fights, including confrontations with Dracula himself, have interesting designs but are marred by these same mechanical issues, making them more frustrating than fun. The soundtrack is atmospheric but not particularly memorable. It tries to capture the haunting essence of the film's score but falls short of being as impactful. The sound effects are serviceable, though sometimes they feel a bit generic, lacking the weight and depth needed for a game with such a gothic theme. Bram Stoker's Dracula on SNES doesn't offer much in terms of replay value. There are no multiple endings or unlockable content to incentivize revisits. Once you've battled your way through the stiff controls and punishing enemy encounters, there's little reason to go back. While it manages to capture some of the visual atmosphere of the film, Bram Stoker's Dracula on the SNES is let down by poor gameplay mechanics and frustrating level design. Fans of the movie or gothic horror may appreciate the aesthetic, but as a platformer, it doesn't stand up well against other titles on the SNES. It's worth a look for die-hard horror game fans or collectors, but don't expect much beyond the visual flair. The boss fights in Bram Stoker's Dracula on the SNES had potential but were ultimately a mixed bag, mostly due to the game's control issues. Each boss encounter, particularly the battles against Dracula in his various forms, had unique designs that tried to mirror the transformations from the movie, such as his bat, wolf, and monstrous forms. The bosses, especially Dracula, are visually impressive for the time. His transformations into different creatures bring some excitement to the game. Each boss has its own thematic approach, and there's a certain intensity in facing Dracula as he becomes more monstrous with each stage. The boss battles do feature different attack patterns and mechanics, meaning you have to adjust your strategy for each fight. For example, Dracula's bat form might have you dodging aerial attacks, while his wolf form could be more focused on fast ground-based assaults. The biggest problem with these fights is the stiff controls. Hitting Dracula or any of the bosses can be frustrating due to the lack of precision in combat. Attacks feel delayed, and dodging enemy moves is often harder than it should be, not because of clever design, but because of awkward controls. Bram Stoker's Dracula on the SNES is not typically considered a hidden gem in the world of retro gaming. While the game has some atmospheric qualities and cool visual design elements, especially with its gothic aesthetic and boss transformations, its flaws in gameplay and overall design prevent it from reaching the status of a hidden gem. Whether Bram Stoker's Dracula on the SNES is worth playing depends largely on what you're looking for in a game. Bram Stoker's Dracula on the SNES isn't an essential play. It's more of a niche title that may hold appeal for fans of the Dracula mythos or collectors, but for most gamers, its clunky gameplay and lack of refinement will make it hard to enjoy. If you're curious or love digging into retro horror-themed games, it might be worth a brief playthrough, but if you're after tight mechanics or memorable gameplay, there are better alternatives.